The first thing they took was the truck. It was a Tuesday morning in late September, and the air over Beaufort County, North Carolina, had that particular thinness it gets just before the leaves turn, sharp and dry, and smelling faintly of wood smoke from somebody's burn pile 2 ridges over. Eleanor Ross was 76 years old and standing barefoot on her own front porch when her son Daniel pulled out of the driveway in the old Ford F-150 her husband Henry had bought new in 1994. She did not call after him. She did not wave. She simply watched the truck go down the long gravel drive she had walked 10,000 times in her life, watched the dust kick up in that way it always had, watched her son's taillights blink once at the cattle gate, and disappear into the bend by the pecan tree. Henry had been dead 11 months. The papers Eleanor had signed 3 weeks earlier sat folded in the kitchen drawer beneath a stack of grocery coupons she would never use. She had signed them on a Saturday afternoon in her own dining room, while her 3 children sat across from her in clothes that had been chosen for the occasion, with a notary public her daughter had brought from town, and a pen Daniel had handed her with the kind of smile a man uses when he is selling something. She had not understood what she was signing. Not all of it. She had understood enough. If you've ever loved a person who came back to you in the form of an old door key in a kitchen drawer, hit the like button and subscribe to Left Behind. Drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. Eleanor had nothing left when this story began. No one knew what was waiting. Keep watching. To understand what they took, you have to understand what was there to take. And to understand that, you have to understand Eleanor and Henry Ross and the 83 acres of farmland that had been the spine of every day of their married life. They had bought the farm in 1971, the year after they were married. Henry was 24, just back from 2 years driving a forklift in Norfolk because the draft board had passed him over for a heart murmur and he hadn't wanted to sit still about it. Eleanor was 22, a farmer's daughter from Pamlico County who had taken one look at Henry Ross at a church social in New Bern and decided. She had a way of deciding that did not require much in the way of argument. Henry had figured that out by the second date and never tried to argue with it again. The farm was 83 acres of mostly tobacco then, with a stand of pines on the back 40 and a creek that ran cold even in August. The house was a 4-bedroom frame structure built in 1923 by a man named Crowder who had run out of money before the trim got finished, which is why the porch railings were a different wood than the porch posts, a fact Eleanor had pointed out to Henry the first time he walked her through it. "I don't mind," she had said. "It just means the house knows what it's like to be left half done. We can finish it." They finished it. Over 50 years, they finished it. They raised 3 children in those rooms, Daniel first in 1973, then Susan in 1975, then Andrew the surprise in 1981. They switched out of tobacco and into soybeans and corn in the late 80s when the writing was on the wall. They added a barn in 92 and rebuilt it after Hurricane Floyd in 99. Henry's hands fixed every fence post on every line of that property. Eleanor's hands canned every jar of tomatoes that came out of the kitchen garden, and there were a great many of them, more than 2 people ever needed, and she gave most of them away. She had been a school nurse at Beaufort County Elementary for 28 years. Henry had farmed and, in the off-seasons, driven a school bus. They had paid off the farm in 2003. They had paid off the truck in 1998. They had a pension from her nursing job and a small monthly check from the soil conservation easement Henry had signed in 2008, and between the two of them, after Henry's Social Security started, they were comfortable. Not rich. Comfortable. Eleanor had never been rich and had never wanted to be. She had wanted to be exactly what she was. A woman who lived in a house with a man who fixed things, in a county where she knew the names of the children she had once put Band-Aids on. Henry died on an October morning in the kitchen. He had gone out to feed the chickens at 6 the way he did every morning, and he had come back in and sat down at the table the way he did every morning, and Eleanor had set a cup of coffee in front of him the way she did every morning, and Henry had said, "Ellie, that smells about right," and then he had not said anything else because his heart had stopped and his head had come down on the placemat with the worn corner, and the coffee had spilled, and Eleanor, who had been a school nurse for 28 years, had known before she touched him. She had sat down in the chair across from him, and she had held his hand for a long time before she called anyone. She had wanted to give him that. The particular quietness of being still loved before the noise of the world arrived. The children came that afternoon, in the order they always came. Daniel from Greenville, where he worked as the regional manager for an agricultural equipment company. Susan from Raleigh, where she was a paralegal in a firm she did not like. Andrew, last, from Charlotte, where he was something in finance Eleanor had never quite been able to follow when he tried to explain it. They had been good children once. She would say that to anyone who asked, and to many who didn't. They had been good children, and they had grown into people she did not always recognize, but they were still her children, and she did not believe in measuring children by the moments when they fell short. She believed in measuring them by the long, slow average of who they tried to be. The grief began to sort itself in the way grief does, and Eleanor had begun to find the shape of her days alone, when Daniel sat her down on a Saturday afternoon in February with what he called a plan. "Mom, we've been talking," he said. Eleanor had been around long enough to know that when one of her children said we've been talking, it meant the talking had been going on without her for some time and had now arrived at a stage where she was being informed of its conclusions. The plan was practical, Daniel said. The plan was responsible. The plan was, frankly, what Dad would have wanted. Eleanor was alone in a 4-bedroom farmhouse on 83 acres. The house was old. The driveway was long. The winters were getting harder. The taxes were what they were. It made sense, Daniel said, to consolidate, to put the property in a family trust, with the 3 children as the managing trustees, so that Eleanor would not have to worry about any of the operational concerns. The pension would flow into the trust. The conservation payment would flow into the trust. The trust would handle the bills, the upkeep, the taxes. Eleanor would receive a monthly stipend for her personal expenses. The farm would stay in the family. Nothing would change, really. Nothing would change at all. Susan had nodded along while Daniel spoke. Andrew had been on his phone. Eleanor had looked at the 3 of them across the dining room table. In the dining room, where she had served 26 Thanksgiving dinners, and she had felt something cold move through her chest that she did not at first recognize. She recognized it later. It was the feeling of being talked about as if she were already gone. "And what is the monthly stipend?" she had asked, because she was a practical woman and because she wanted to see if Daniel had thought through to the end of his own plan. Daniel had named a number. The number was $400 a month. Eleanor's pension had been $1,700. Henry's Social Security had been just over $2,100. The conservation payment ran $800 a month. Together, before any of this, she had been receiving $4,600 a month. The stipend Daniel was proposing was less than 10% of what she had been managing on her own without anyone's help for 53 years. "I see," Eleanor had said. What she said next was something she had thought about for a long time afterward, because it had been, she came to understand, the moment in which she had agreed to her own undoing. She had said, "Let me think about it." She should have said no. She should have said, "Get out of my house." She should have said, "Your father is not 11 months in the ground, and you're sitting at his table, dividing him up like a hog." But Eleanor had been a mother for 48 years, and a mother does not throw her children out of her own dining room. A mother thinks about it. She thought about it for 2 weeks, and in those 2 weeks, the children worked on her with the patient, organized pressure of people who had clearly read the same book on how to handle a difficult parent. Susan called every day. Daniel sent printouts about elder financial management. Andrew, who had said almost nothing in the dining room, called once, and what he said was, "Mom, just sign the papers. We all just want this to be easy on you." It was Andrew's call that did it. Her youngest, the boy who used to climb into her bed at night when there was thunder. He had said the words "easy on you" in a voice she did not know. She signed the papers on a Saturday in March. She signed 3 different documents, and the notary stamped each one, and Daniel collected them in a folder, and Susan made coffee, and Andrew left within 10 minutes of the signing because he had a flight to catch. By June, the truck was registered in Daniel's name. By July, the bank account into which her pension had been deposited for 23 years had been closed and replaced by an account she did not have access to. By August, the conservation check went somewhere she could not see. The $400 stipend appeared in a small checking account Susan had opened for her at a bank she had never used. Susan had given her a debit card and a single sheet of paper with the password written on it. By September, Daniel had moved his family into the farmhouse. To help take care of the property, he had said, to have someone there with you. His wife, Brenda, who had never in 20 years asked Eleanor about her garden, suddenly had opinions about the kitchen layout. The two grandchildren Eleanor had not seen in 4 years arrived with iPads and a wariness around her that suggested they had been told things. Within 6 weeks of moving in, Daniel had explained that the master bedroom would make more sense as the children's playroom, and that Eleanor would be more comfortable, truly more comfortable, Mom, in the small back bedroom that had been Andrew's as a boy. The one with the window that did not open all the way and the radiator that knocked. Eleanor moved her things into the back bedroom on a Wednesday afternoon, alone, while Brenda was at a yoga class in town. She moved Henry's reading glasses, which she had kept on his nightstand for 11 months. She moved the photograph of the two of them at Carolina Beach in 1979 that he had loved. She moved her mother's wedding ring, which she kept in a small ceramic dish. She did not cry. She had cried for Henry. She would not cry for a bedroom. That night, in the small bed under the knocking radiator, with her family of grown children and grandchildren sleeping in the room she had filled and emptied and filled again over 50 years, Eleanor lay awake and thought about the cabin. She had not thought about the cabin in a long time. It had belonged to her father. Her father had been a man named Walter Truitt, born in 1909 in Hyde County, dead in 1987 of a stroke at the kitchen table the way Henry had died, which Eleanor had always taken as a sign that the men of her life had at least gotten that part right, going quick at the table where they ate. Her father had owned a small piece of land up in the foothills of the Brushy Mountains, near a place called Bear Hollow in Wilkes County, 3.5 hours west, in a country Eleanor had not driven through since she was a teenager. Her father had built a cabin on that land in 1953. He had built it with his own hands, with help from his brother Earl, over the course of 2 summers. It was a one-room cabin, plus a sleeping loft, plus a small lean-to kitchen that had been added later. Walter had used it as a hunting cabin, mostly. He had taken Eleanor up there twice when she was a girl, once in the fall when she was 9, and once in the spring when she was 13, and the rest of the time it had been a place he went alone, or with Earl, to be in the woods and not be in town. When her father died in 1987, the cabin had passed to Eleanor. She was the only child. There had been no will to speak of, just a single sheet of paper Walter had handwritten and signed and given to a lawyer in Belhaven for safekeeping. The paper said, "To my daughter Eleanor, the land at Bear Hollow and what stands on it, with my hope that she finds use for it." That was the entire document. Henry and Eleanor had driven up to the cabin twice in the years after her father's death. Once in 1989 to look at it and to clean what could be cleaned, and once in 1995 after Henry got in his head that they might fix it up as a vacation place. They had stayed 3 days that second time, and Eleanor had decided that the place was too far, the road was too rough, and the work would never end. They had left and not gone back. The land had sat for 28 years. She had paid the property tax on it every January out of habit. She had never once mentioned it to her children. She did not remember why. Perhaps because there had been no occasion. Perhaps because it had felt like her father's, not theirs. Perhaps because some things in a life are simply yours and you do not need to share them, even with the people you love. When the children had drawn up the trust documents, no one had asked her about other property. The papers had listed the farmhouse and the 83 acres and the F-150 and the bank accounts and the pension and the conservation payment. They had not listed Bear Hollow. They had not known about Bear Hollow. The deed was in Eleanor's name alone, filed in the Wilkes County Courthouse, 3.5 hours and 2 mountain ranges away from any of them. In the small bed in the small bedroom of the house she had built, Eleanor Ross lay awake at 3 in the morning and thought they forgot. The next morning, she got up before anyone else in the house was stirring. She made herself a cup of coffee in the kitchen that no longer felt like hers and drank it standing at the window above the sink. The light was just coming up over the back field, the field Henry had walked every morning of their married life. She could see the line of pines on the back 40. She could see the barn roof he had rebuilt after Floyd. She could see the place where the old well had been before they capped it in 2002. Every inch of that land had Henry on it, and in another month, in another year, None of it would be hers in any way that mattered. She finished her coffee and washed the cup and put it back in the cabinet where it belonged. She walked quietly to the back bedroom. She pulled an old canvas duffel bag out from under the bed, a bag Henry had bought for a fishing trip in 1986 and never thrown away. And into it she put 3 changes of clothes, a pair of work boots, a flashlight, a paring knife, a hand towel, the photograph from Carolina Beach, her mother's ring, and Henry's reading glasses. She went to the kitchen drawer. She took out her debit card. She took out the small folded bundle of cash she kept in the back of the silverware tray. Money she had been setting aside $10 and $20 at a time for a year. Money that came to $412. She took out one more thing. A small envelope she had kept in that drawer for 38 years. Inside the envelope was a single iron key on a leather thong, blackened with age, the kind of key that fit the kind of lock that was built before anyone in the family had been born. The key her father had handed her 2 weeks before he died, with no explanation and no instruction. Only the words, "You'll know what to do when the time comes, Eleanor. Don't lose it." She had not lost it. She put the key around her neck, under her shirt, where it lay flat against her chest the way it must have lain flat against her father's chest for the last 20 years of his life. She put the duffel over her shoulder. She took her car keys from a hook by the back door, the keys to the 2009 Toyota Camry that was still in her name, that Daniel had been planning to sell next month, and which he had not gotten around to yet. She left a single sheet of paper on the kitchen table, where Brenda would find it when she came down to make breakfast. The paper said, "I'm going to take some time. I'm safe. Do not look for me. Eleanor." She drove west out of Beaufort County as the sun was coming up. She did not look in the rearview mirror. She drove for 3.5 hours through country that grew slowly stranger as it climbed, the flat farmland giving way to rolling pasture, the rolling pasture giving way to foothills, the foothills giving way at last to the long blue spine of the brushy mountains rising out of the morning haze. She stopped once for gas in Statesville and once for a biscuit at a Hardee's outside Wilkesboro, and the woman at the counter at the Hardee's looked at her and said, "You doing all right, honey?" And Eleanor said, "I'm getting there." And the woman nodded as if she had heard that answer many times before and given it herself. The road into Bear Hollow was the same road it had been in 1995. It had not been paved. It had not been graded. It went from county blacktop to county gravel to a narrow track of dirt and rock that climbed up between 2 ridges and ran out beside a creek that Eleanor remembered, even after 28 years, by the sound of it. The cabin came into view exactly where it had always been, on a small clearing on the east-facing slope where her father had first stood in the summer of 1952 and said to his brother Earl, "This is the place, Earl. You can hear the creek and you can see the sun." It was still there. The roof was low. The porch sagged. The chimney leaned. A pine had fallen across the back corner of the lean-to kitchen sometime in the last decade and split the roof open, and a tarpaulin had been thrown over the gap by some hunter sometime long enough ago that the tarpaulin had rotted through. Eleanor Ross sat in her car with the engine off and looked at her father's cabin, and the iron key around her neck warmed against her skin in the late morning sun. And she said, out loud, to no one, "All right, Daddy. I'm here." The door of the cabin was not locked. That was the first thing that didn't make sense. Eleanor had expected to need a key, had expected her father's old padlock, the one she remembered from her childhood, the one she had tried twice with a hairpin when she was 11 and her father had laughed at her for trying. But the padlock was gone. The hasp was still there, screwed into the doorframe with the same square head screws her father had used in 1953, but the lock that should have been hanging from it was simply not there. She stood on the porch with her hand on the door for a long minute before she pushed it open. The hinges complained the way hinges complain after a long silence. The smell that came out was the smell of a place sealed against weather and not against time, with smoke from a fire long cold, the particular dryness of cedar, and underneath it, faint but present, the smell of pipe tobacco. Her father had smoked a pipe, cherry blend, from a tin he kept in his coat pocket. He had been dead for 38 years. Eleanor stepped inside. The cabin had 2 rooms on the ground floor and a sleeping loft above. The main room held a stone fireplace, a table she remembered, 2 chairs she did not, a small wood stove against the east wall, and a row of shelves along the north wall holding a kerosene lantern, 3 cans of beans whose labels had gone yellow, but were still readable, a tin of coffee, and a stack of newspapers tied with twine. She crossed to the newspapers and lifted the top one. It was the Wilkes Journal-Patriot, dated April 14th, 2019. 6 years ago, someone had been in this cabin in 2019. Someone had bought a newspaper in town and brought it up the rough road and left it folded on her father's shelf. The cabin she had not visited in 28 years had been visited by someone, and that someone had left things in tidy order, and that someone had, at some point, taken the padlock off the door. She set the newspaper down. She was not afraid. She was a woman who had been a school nurse for 28 years and a farmer's wife for 50, and she had learned a long time ago that fear was not a useful response to information. Information was a useful response to information. She would gather more. She walked the cabin slowly. The 2 chairs at the table were chairs she did not remember from her childhood, but they were old chairs, hand-built, the kind of chair a man with a workshop in time made rather than bought. There was a small bookshelf in the corner she did not remember either, and on it, perhaps 20 books. Paperbacks, mostly mysteries and westerns, a few titles in Spanish, and a single hardcover book wedged at the end of the row. She pulled it out. It was a Bible, King James, leather-bound, worn soft at the corners, and when she opened it to the flyleaf, her father's handwriting was on the page. Walter Truett, 1948. Bear Hollow. Below it, in different ink, in a hand she did not at first recognize, was a second line. Earl Truett, 1990. Eleanor sat down in one of the chairs at the table and held the Bible in her lap. Her father's brother, Earl, her uncle, whom she had not seen since her father's funeral in 1987, whom her father had built the cabin with in 1953, whom she had assumed had died sometime in the 1990s, because that was what Earl's daughter Lorraine had told her once at a family reunion in 1998. Daddy passed a few years ago, Eleanor. Didn't anyone tell you? And Eleanor had said no. No one had told her, and she had not pushed for details because Earl and her father had had a falling out late in life, and Eleanor had never known the shape of it. But Earl had written his name in this Bible in 1990, 3 years after her father's death, after he was supposedly dead himself, according to his own daughter. Eleanor closed the Bible carefully and set it on the table. She had been in the cabin for less than 15 minutes, and the cabin had already begun, in the quiet way old places do, to revise everything she thought she knew. She built a fire in the wood stove. She did this slowly and badly, as Shel Mercer had once built a fire badly in another mountain cabin in another decade, and she figured out by the 3rd try the way people figure things out when they have nowhere else to be. The kindling was stacked in a wooden crate beside the stove, and the kindling was dry, which meant it had been brought in and stored under cover, which meant whoever had been here last had been thinking about the next person who came. By 2 in the afternoon, the cabin was warm enough to take off her coat. Eleanor sat at the table with her father's Bible in front of her and a tin cup of coffee beside it. There had been an unopened sleeve of paper filters in the kitchen lean-to, and a glass percolator that had survived 28 years of nothing happening to it. And she began to do what she had come to do, even though she had not known until that moment that she had come to do it. She began to look. It was on the back of the cabin's interior door, hidden behind a coat that had been hanging on a peg since before her father died, that she found the first specific thing. A small brass plate, the kind of hardware store used to sell for marking property, screwed into the wood at eye level. The plate had been engraved by hand. The engraving said, W.T. 1953. Box behind the second hearthstone. Key on the chain around her neck. Eleanor read the words 4 times. She put her hand to her chest, where the iron key her father had given her 2 weeks before he died had been lying flat against her skin since 6 o'clock that morning. She lifted it free of her shirt and held it up to the light from the cabin's small west window, and she looked at the iron key for a long time, and she thought about Walter Truett, who had handed her this key in 1987 with no explanation, and she thought about the second hearthstone, and she thought about the fact that her father had screwed a brass plate to the back of his cabin door 30 years before he died, and had then given her the key, and had then said only, "You'll know what to do when the time comes." She had not known what to do for 38 years. She thought she might know now. If this story has found its way to you, Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story from Left Behind. Your support is what keeps these stories coming, and there are so many more waiting to be told. She crossed the fireplace. The hearth was made of 7 flat stones set into mortar. The first stone was the long one closest to the firebox, and the second stone was the broad one immediately in front of it, the stone a person stepped on first when they walked up to lay a fire. Eleanor knelt down beside it and pressed. It did not move. She pressed harder. It did not move. She got the paring knife from her duffel bag and worked the blade along the seam where the stone met the mortar, and the seam was not mortar at all. It was a strip of dark wax, pressed in carefully and finished smooth. She worked the knife around the full perimeter of the stone, scraping the wax out in a thin curl, and when she had cleared the seam, she set the heels of both hands on the far edge of the stone and lifted. The stone came up. Beneath the second hearthstone was a recess, perhaps 8 inches deep, lined with sheet copper to keep the moisture out, and inside the recess was a metal box. Eleanor sat down on the hearth and looked at the box for a moment before she lifted it out. She was not in a hurry. She had waited 38 years. The cabin was warm. The light through the west window was the slow gold light of mountain afternoons, and outside, the creek her father had loved was running over the stones it had run over for 100,000 years, and there was nowhere on earth Eleanor needed to be except exactly where she was. She lifted the box out. It was iron, square, heavy in a way that surprised her. There was a single keyhole on the front, and the keyhole was the size and shape of the iron key that had hung against her chest for 38 years. She took the key from around her neck. She fit it into the lock. She turned it. The lock opened. Inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth, were 3 things. The first was a deed. It was not the deed to the cabin. The deed to the cabin was filed in the courthouse in Wilkesboro, and Eleanor had paid taxes on it every January for 38 years. This was a different deed, dated November 1953, in her father's name, for a parcel of land described as the Easter Hollow and Ridgeline, 240 acres more or less, beginning at the marker stone at Bear Hollow and running due east to the ridge spine, thence north along the spine to the gap, thence west along the Gap Creek to the point of beginning. 240 acres. Adjoining the cabin. Land Eleanor had not known her father owned. The second thing was a thick envelope of papers, tied with the same kind of twine her father had used to tie the newspapers on the shelf, and on the front of the envelope was written, in her father's handwriting, the words for Eleanor when she finds it. The third thing was a smaller envelope. It was newer. The handwriting on the front was not her father's. The handwriting was an old man's handwriting, careful and slow, and it said, "Eleanor, read your daddy's letter first. Then read this. Earl." Eleanor sat on the hearth with the iron box open in her lap, and 3 men's words waiting for her, 2 of them dead. One of them, apparently, not as dead as she had been told, and she felt for the first time in 11 months a thing she had not expected to feel again. She felt that she was being addressed, that somebody had been thinking of her, in fact, for a very long time. 300 miles east, on the farm in Beaufort County, Daniel Ross was standing in the kitchen reading the note Eleanor had left. He read it 3 times. Then he handed it to Brenda, who read it once, and looked up at him with a face that had stopped being patient. Where would she go? Brenda said. She wouldn't go anywhere, Daniel said. She doesn't have anywhere to go. Daniel, she's gone. Her car is gone. She left a note that says, "Don't look for me." Daniel walked to the kitchen drawer, where Eleanor had kept her debit card. The card was not there. He walked to the silverware tray. The bundle of bills she had been quietly setting aside, the bills he had been counting in his head every week for a year and intending eventually to address, was not there either. She took her cash, he said. How much cash? I don't know. 300-400. Not enough to go far. He called Susan. Susan was at her firm in Raleigh and answered on the 3rd ring with the brisk impatience of a woman with a busy day. He told her. There was a long silence on the line. Did she say anything to you on Sunday? Susan said. She said the back bedroom was fine. She said the window didn't open all the way, and I told her I'd look at it. Did you look at it? I haven't gotten to it yet. Another silence. I'll call Andrew, Susan said. Don't call the police. Not yet. If she just took a drive somewhere, The police means a paper trail, and we don't need a paper trail. What kind of paper trail? Daniel, she's 76, and we just put her property in trust. If she's having some kind of episode, and we file a missing persons report, the questions get complicated very fast. Find her quietly. Call me back. Daniel hung up the phone. He stood in the kitchen of the house his mother had built, and he looked at the note in his hand. And for the first time since the funeral, he felt the small, specific feeling of a man who has been certain of something and has just begun to understand that he might not be. In the cabin in Bear Hollow, Eleanor untied the twine on the envelope marked for Eleanor when she finds it, and she unfolded the first sheet of paper, and she began to read what her father had written for her in 1986, the year before he died, when he had known something Eleanor was only now beginning to suspect. She read by the light of the kerosene lantern she had lit at the table, and the cabin was warm, and the iron key lay on the table beside her, and outside, the creek ran the way it had always run. She read for a long time. The letter from her father was 4 pages long, and it was written in pencil on the lined paper he had used for everything important in his life, because Walter Truitt had not trusted ink for anything that mattered. He believed pencil could be corrected, and that anything worth writing was worth correcting. Eleanor, the letter began. If you are reading this, you found the box, and the time has come the way I told you it would. I am sorry I did not say more in 1987. I did not say more because I did not know which of the things I was afraid of would come true, and I did not want to put a fear into you that might never need to be there. So I gave you the key, and I told you would know, and I trusted that you are my daughter, and that knowing is something you have always been good at. The land you are sitting on is not what your tax bill says it is. The cabin is on 3 acres, which is what is filed under your name in the Wilkesboro courthouse. The 240 acres around it, the Eastern Hollow and the Ridge and the Gap Creek, were put into a trust in November of 1953, 2 months before you were born. The trust is in your name, and it has been in your name for 73 years. You did not know about it, because the trust was set up to be silent. The papers in this envelope are the trust documents and the name of the lawyer in North Wilkesboro who has held them for me. His name is Henry Ledford. If he is dead by the time you read this, his son Tom has the file. They have been paid through 2030. Go see them. The reason I did this, Eleanor, is that my own father lost his land in 1934 because he trusted his brothers, and I watched what that did to him. And I made a promise to myself when you were born that no daughter of mine would ever sit at a table and have her own family explain to her what was hers. The trust cannot be undone by anyone but you, and only in person, in front of the lawyer with the iron key. That is how it was written, and that is how it stands. The land has timber on it. Good timber, oak and poplar, and a stand of black walnut up near the gap that your Uncle Earl and I planted in 1958. The timber has been managed under a forestry contract since 1971. The income from the timber goes into the trust account. I do not know what the account holds today, as I write this in 1986, but I know what it held when I last checked, and I know what oak and walnut are worth, and I know that the account has been growing for 33 years without anyone drawing from it. Earl is up there. I know Lorraine told the family I had no brother left. Lorraine told that story because Earl asked her to. Earl had reasons. Earl will explain them himself if he is still living when you find this letter. If he is not, the second envelope will tell you what you need to know. Eleanor, the land is yours. It has always been yours. Do with it what you decide is right. I trust you to decide. I always have. Daddy. Eleanor folded the letter carefully and set it down on the table next to the kerosene lantern. She did not cry. She had not cried for the bedroom, and she did not cry now, although she understood that something inside her had moved into a different room, the way a person sometimes does in their own life, walking through a doorway that has always been there and only just now opened. She picked up the second envelope, the one in the older hand. She broke the seal. Eleanor, her Uncle Earl had written, I am 91 years old as I write this. I do not know what year you will read it. I have lived in a small house I built for myself half a mile up the Gap Creek from the cabin since 1991, after my wife passed, and I no longer had a reason to be down in the world. Your father and I had a falling out in 1984 over a thing that does not matter anymore. I asked Lorraine to tell the family I had died because I did not want anyone coming up here and trying to bring me back to a life I had finished with. Lorraine kept her word. She's a good girl. I have been watching the cabin. I'm the one who took the padlock off the door because I knew the lock would only confuse you when you came, and the iron key was always meant for the box, not the door. I am the one who left the kindling and the coffee and the newspapers, although I confess I stopped buying newspapers in 2019 because my eyes are not what they were. I'm the one who put a tarp over the leak in the lean-to badly. I have been here a long time, Eleanor, and I have been waiting for you, and I have not been impatient about it because you came when you needed to come, and that is how these things work. Walk up the Gap Creek tomorrow morning. There is a path. I have kept it clear. You will find me at the end of it. Bring coffee. Earl. Eleanor sat in the warm cabin with both letters in her hands, and outside, the long blue evening of the southern Appalachians came down over the ridge, and she did not light the lantern again because she did not need to. The wood stove threw enough light. The creek ran. Somewhere on her own land, half a mile up the gap, an old man she had not known was alive was sitting in his own small house, waiting for her to bring him coffee in the morning. She slept that night in the sleeping loft of her father's cabin, on a mattress Earl had clearly replaced sometime in the last decade, under a quilt her mother had made in 1962. She slept the whole night through. It was the first time she had done that in 11 months. In the morning, she walked up the Gap Creek with the percolator in one hand and a tin of coffee in the other. And at the end of the path, exactly where Earl had said it would be, was a small log house, and on the porch of the house was a man so old he looked carved, with white hair and her father's eyes and her father's hands, and he stood up when he saw her, and Eleanor Ross, who had not cried for a bedroom and had not cried for a letter, stopped in the path and put down the percolator and the coffee and stood with her hands at her sides while the morning light came through the trees, and Earl Truitt walked down the porch steps slowly and said, "Hello, Ellie. You look just like your mama." She drove into North Wilkesboro 3 days later, with Earl in the passenger seat, and they sat together in the office of Tom Ledford, attorney at law, son of Henry Ledford, who had died in 2014 but had passed the file on as carefully as Walter Truitt had passed the iron key. Tom Ledford was 61 years old and had grown up hearing about the Truitt Trust the way other children grew up hearing fairy tales, and he opened the file with an expression Eleanor would later think of as the expression of a man who had been waiting most of his professional life for a particular door to open. The trust account, after 73 years of timber proceeds and quiet compounding and the careful management of a Wilkes County lawyer who had charged exactly what the trust document said he could charge and not a dollar more, held $1 million for $172,000. The land itself, 240 acres of mature hardwood forest in a county where mature hardwood forest had become very rare and very valuable, had been appraised the previous spring at $3,100,000. Eleanor signed 3 forms in Tom Ledford's office. The forms transferred the trust into her direct control, recorded her assumption of the deed, and noted, for the record, that the iron key had been produced and verified. She drove back up to the cabin that afternoon with Earl beside her, and she did not say much, and Earl did not say much, and they did not need to. Daniel Ross found his mother on a Saturday afternoon in early November, 8 days after she had driven west. He found her because Susan, who was a paralegal and knew her way around a public records search, had finally thought to look at the property tax filings under Eleanor's maiden name, Truitt, and had found the Wilkes County parcel and the cabin Eleanor had paid taxes on for 38 years without mentioning. The 3 children drove up together in Daniel's Suburban. They came up the rough road in the late afternoon with the practiced confidence of people who have rehearsed what they will say. Daniel had prepared a short speech about concern. Susan had brought a folder. Andrew had not said much on the drive. Eleanor was on the cabin porch when they arrived. She was sitting in one of her father's chairs with a cup of coffee on the rail beside her, and Earl was sitting in the other chair, and the two of them looked up together as the Suburban pulled into the clearing, the way 2 people look up who have been expecting visitors but are in no particular hurry about it. Daniel got out first. He took in the cabin, the porch, the old man, the mother he had last seen in a back bedroom under a knocking radiator, and his face did the small involuntary thing a face does when its owner has just realized the situation is not the situation he prepared for. "Mom," he said. "Daniel." Eleanor said. Susan got out. Andrew got out last. They stood in a small, uncertain row at the foot of the porch steps, and nobody, for a long moment, said anything. "This is your great-uncle Earl," Eleanor said. "He has been alive this whole time. Lorraine told you a story in 1998. The story was not true. Earl asked her to tell it because he wanted to be left alone. I'm telling you now because I do not want any more stories." Earl nodded once at the children. He did not stand up. "Mom, we've been worried sick," Susan said. "I left a note," Eleanor said. "The note said, 'Don't look for you.' We had no idea where you were. We didn't know if you were. You knew I had a car. You knew I had cash. You knew I had left a note in my own handwriting saying I was safe. You did not call the police because Susan told Daniel a paper trail would be inconvenient given what you had just done with the trust. I know this because I called the sheriff's office in Beaufort County on Monday morning to let them know I was fine and not to mind any reports, and they told me there had been no reports. So let us not pretend you were worried sick. Let us pretend, instead, that we are all adults and that we're going to have an honest conversation." The three of them stood in the clearing and did not have anything immediately to say to that. Eleanor set her coffee down. She did not raise her voice. She had never been a woman who raised her voice. She was a woman who said true things in a regular tone, and she had found across 76 years that the regular tone was usually enough. "You took the farm," she said. "You took the truck. You took the pension and the conservation payment and my checking account, and you put me in a back bedroom in the house I built. I signed those papers because I did not want to be the kind of mother who threw her grown children out of her own dining room. That was my mistake. It was a mistake of love, and I'm not ashamed of it, but it was a mistake. What you did not know is that my father set up a trust for me in 1953. The trust holds 240 acres of hardwood forest adjoining this cabin and an account that has been compounding for 73 years. The land and the account together are worth a little over $4.5 million. The trust is in my name only. It cannot be touched by your trust, by your power of attorney, by anything you signed in March. My father knew what families could do to a daughter who had nothing of her own. He made sure I would have something." Susan opened her mouth. Eleanor lifted one finger and Susan closed it. "I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to do with the money. That is not your business. What I'm going to tell you is what is going to happen next. On Monday morning, I'm driving to Greenville with Tom Ledford, who is my attorney now. We're going to dissolve the family trust you put me in. The farm reverts to my name. The pension reverts to my account. The truck reverts to me. Daniel, you and Brenda, and the children will have until the end of January to find another place to live. I'm not putting you out of the cold. I am giving you 90 days, which is more than most landlords give, and considerably more than you gave me when you decided the master bedroom would make a better playroom. After January, the farm will be mine again. I'm going to live in it for the rest of my life. When I am gone, the farm will go to whichever of you, or which combination of you, has spent the time between now and then acting like my children instead of acting like my executors. That is going to be my decision, and it is going to be made on the basis of what I see, not what I am told." Andrew, the youngest, the one who had said easy on you into the phone in March, sat down slowly on the bottom step of the porch with his back to her, the way he had used to sit on the back steps of the farmhouse when he was 9 years old and had done something he could not undo. "Mom," he said. He said it the way a person says it when there is nothing after the word. "I know," Eleanor said. She let them stand there for a long minute. Earl, beside her, looked at the three of them with the steady, unembarrassed patience of a man who had watched a great many things go wrong and right in his 91 years and had stopped being surprised by either. "You can come up onto the porch," Eleanor said at last. "There is coffee." Earl made it strong. "We can sit, and you can tell me what you're going to do with the next 90 days, and I will listen. I'm still your mother. I'm not a different person than I was on Tuesday. I'm only a person you know more about now." Susan was the first to come up the steps. She did it slowly, the way a person walks who has just understood something about herself. Daniel followed. Andrew was last, and he had to wipe his face on his sleeve before he came up, and nobody mentioned it, and that was its own kind of mercy. They sat on the porch into the evening. They did not solve everything. They did not solve very much. Eleanor had not expected to. She had only expected to be heard. She moved back into the farmhouse on the 1st of February. Daniel's family found a rental in Greenville before the deadline, and Daniel called every Sunday after that, not because he was good yet, but because he was practicing. Susan came up 2 weekends a month and helped with the garden. Andrew quit his finance job in April and took 6 months to figure out who he was, and then took another job for less money, closer to home, and visited every other Friday. They were not yet the children Eleanor had raised. They were the children those children might still grow into, given time, and Eleanor, who had been a mother for 53 years, knew that growing took as long as it took. Earl stayed in his small house up the gap. Eleanor drove up to see him every other Tuesday until he died in his sleep in March of the following year, 92 years old, in a bed he had built himself, in a country he had loved as long as her father had loved it. She buried him next to her father's wife in a small family plot in Hyde County, with both of their names on stones that had finally been allowed to be honest. She kept the cabin. She kept the 240 acres of hardwood forest, and she did not log them, and she did not develop them, and she put the trust account into a foundation she named for Walter Truitt, and the foundation paid the property tax on small family lands across 3 counties for daughters whose families had forgotten they existed. She kept the iron key around her neck. She told her grandchildren, when they finally started coming back to see her, the story of the cabin, and the story of the box, and the story of a father who had known that love does not always protect a daughter from her own family, and had quietly arranged 73 years before he had any reason to know it would matter, that this particular daughter would always have somewhere of her own. Thank you for sitting with this story all the way to the end. The people who stay for the whole story are the ones who understand it. If it moved you, the videos on your screen right now are waiting to do the same. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come home. Left Behind has a story for you.